Morning. I guess this is the third and last, so let's try to keep it short so you can see all kinds of other things. So this is a picture of our Research and Innovation Center in Palo Alto. We're actually part of three Research and Innovation Centers that Ford has, the original one being in Dearborn, Michigan, where we have our headquarters, one in Aachen, Germany, and we're the newest kid on the block. We opened this, and I'll show you later in January 2015. Why did we have to open this office here? It's a couple of things. There are global trends affecting mobility, and there are technology trends that made us come here to take advantage of the technology that is taking place in Silicon Valley. So first of all, we have this trend towards urbanization. So we have the number of mega cities that are increasing. You can't just pump more cars in those cities even though the population is increasing. You need to think about how you actually move people from point A to point B in areas that are getting more and more crowded. Then there is the middle class growth. So as the population in the middle class is growing, they have different needs than when you didn't have this. So we're trying to address this middle class growth, and again, in some areas, you can address it because this is going to be their first car that they can own. In other places, you can't, and mobility becomes a lot more important than actually selling them a vehicle. Air quality is getting worse throughout the world, and we need to be stewards of the planet, and we need to take responsibility for that. So again, how do we participate in improving the air quality, in making things better for the world population? And lastly is the new trends that the millennials have, basically delaying a lot of decisions. Yes, eventually everyone is going to get married, everyone is going to have kids, everyone eventually wants to own some, at least partly, of the vehicles that they need for mobility. But we see this delay in their decisions, and we see this focus that they put on the value of access to mobility rather than ownership. So we're trying to address those trends through technology. At the same time, in terms of technology, we're seeing autonomy and robotics becoming a lot more important, having a bigger impact on our daily lives, and that affects how also you use a vehicle. Machine learning, obviously, I don't need to tell you, but in the last 5 years or so, obviously we've had huge advances that allow a lot of this autonomy to take place. Processing power, GPUs, sensors, a lot of other silicon devices that are coming on market now, allowing for much better compute power than we've ever had before. And of course, the consumer expectations for connectivity, for having smart devices, for having basically the car be part of their digital life, an integral part of their digital life. So based on these trends, we started the office with these 5 pillars in mind. Connectivity, so basically connecting the car to the internet and having it always connected just like all your other devices. So the car basically becoming a node on the internet, or another way to put it, and it pays me to say it as a car guy, the car becomes just another T in IoT, so it becomes just another thing that's connected to the internet. Mobility, so looking at how we move people from point A to point B other than just selling them a vehicle. And how does it make sense to do that? What are the trends? How do people use mobility in different parts of the world? Because it does vary tremendously even in the US from one coast to the other. Autonomous vehicles, obviously a huge part of what we're doing, looking both at the technology and the business model of autonomous vehicles. The consumer experience, it's how do you make the consumer experience different in an autonomous vehicle versus current vehicles? Even in manually driven vehicles, honestly, all of us, all OES have been guilty for a very long time of basically designing by engineers for engineers rather than for human beings. So we basically would just dump more buttons that they have single features. So how do we step back from that and try to think of that holistic experience that you need to have in the vehicle, and then look for the technology that would enable that? So trying to have a much more human approach to how we design our vehicles and what that experience inside the vehicle is. And lastly, with cars becoming basically probes in their environment, so sensors everywhere in the vehicle and around them. How do you make sense of all that data so that you make the experience better for the user, so that we can become a better car company, so that the infrastructure can be utilized better and provide some of that information back to the cities. So trying to bring all that together through data analytics. So basically what we've been looking for, in summary, it's things that Silicon Valley can offer. Software, sensors, and compute platforms. And obviously we're not the only ones here. We're now part of a much bigger community of automotive manufacturers and tier 1 suppliers. As I was introduced, I did my PhD in autonomous vehicles. I work for another, I did in autonomous vehicles. Although you could call them automated, because 20 years ago they weren't really autonomous. I work for another car company in the Valley, and we've always been kind of the oddball out in Silicon Valley. Like, people were always trying to understand why the hell are we here. For the last few years, it's been nice to see that not only people are understanding us, but auto tech is a thing. We're finally the cool kids on the block. So it's kind of good to be part of this community of automotive in Silicon Valley that's constantly expanding. So as I said, we opened our office in January 2015. We grew it from about 10 people to about 180. And what we're trying to do is basically be a microcosm of Ford. So within this 180 people, we actually have representation from about 22 groups from within Ford. So we have representation from a lot of the engineering areas, but also marketing and sales, ethnographers, industrial design. So we're trying to combine sort of the hard sciences with the softer sciences in order to have a holistic approach to our engagement with Silicon Valley. I personally, I spent my entire career in the Valley, but I have a partner who has spent her entire career at Ford. So we're combining these two networks to make the transition of the technology that we find here a lot easier into the mothership. So what we've done so far, not only are we taking advantage of the talent that we have within the four walls, but we want to make sure that we're integral part of Silicon Valley, of this ecosystem that's created here. So far we've interacted with over 600 startups. We're actively working with about 50 of them on various projects, various stages of interaction. We've connected with over 60 VC firms, dozens of incubators, the 5 leading universities in Silicon Valley, and we have projects, depending on the technology that we work on. Either we work on a project here locally and we build it up enough to show a proof of concept back in the mothership, or when the technology doesn't make sense for us to work on, either because we don't have the knowledge or the resources, or maybe it's completely outside of our skill area, then we end up being a bridge between Silicon Valley and Dearborn. So those are projects that we call pass-through projects. So we ended up, and I'll talk about more this later, working anywhere from manufacturing to advertising. So those are areas where we can actually act as translators, act as a bridge between what happens in Silicon Valley and what happens back in the mothership. We're also expanding our campus, so pretty soon we'll have the ability to house over 300 people. So we're growing our presence in the Valley, both in terms of people, but also in terms of scope. So these are a few of the sample projects that we work on to get a sense of the scope of what we work on, because the really interesting thing is that what automotive is nowadays is becoming much broader, and it's literally almost everything, because we're interested in everything from software to materials to user interfaces to all kinds of things that even a few years ago those were not considered automotive. But at the same time, we need to sort of filter them and give you feedback if it really that makes sense or not. So here's a few samples. So in terms of Internet of Things, we've made this interface with Alexa. We've announced it at CES, where basically if you have an Amazon Echo at home, you can check the status of your vehicle. You can turn on the engine on and off. You can lock and lock, preset the temperature. And the other way around, from the vehicle, you can control things inside the house, like lights and putting things on your shopping list, or if you're in the car going shopping, you can check things that you put on your shopping list while you're at home. We've also, in terms of mobility, we now have for Smart Mobility, which is a separate entity. It's a separate LLC that we created so that basically they have more freedom to act differently. And they're looking basically at different business models and how, again, moving people from point A to point B. And they have so far two prongs. A main one is urban mobility with how do we move people currently through shared vans. And we've also acquired Chariot. And the other one is the business model of autonomous vehicles. So once autonomous vehicles become reality, how do we use them? What is the business model? What is the best way to implement a service based on autonomous vehicles? In terms of data analytics, this is actually a really cool project we've done. We didn't stay focused on just cars, but in this case, we partnered with an NGO, Riders for Health. They deliver medicine in Africa by motorcycle. So the case is that there are some villages in Africa that are so remote that you can only access them by single track paths. So even though we donated a bunch of Ford Rangers to deliver medicine to some of the outskirts towns, some of these towns are so remote that you actually need to get on a motorcycle and deliver the medicine from, because trucks can't go there. So we've actually put telematics on those motorcycles so we understand how the riders use them, how often they need fuel, how often they need maintenance. And in addition to that, those paths are obviously not on the radar screen of someone like a TomTom or here. So we allow them to digitize those paths. And more interestingly, because those paths actually sometimes disappear with the monsoon season, dynamically actually change the path to indicate which way is the right way to go to deliver the medicine. In terms of consumer experience, as I said, we're trying to have a much more holistic approach of your experience in the vehicle. So we're looking at natural language research. We're looking at better designs, user interfaces, how we can, again, connect you with the vehicle and make that experience a lot better. And of course, autonomous vehicles is one of the main areas that we work on. Ford is obviously enrolled in the California testing for autonomous vehicles. We've actually had over 10 years of autonomous vehicle development program. So we were actually part of the original DARPA challenge. We've done a lot of work in this area. And going forward, we plan to have level 4 mass-produced vehicles by 2021 in geofenced areas in several major urban areas. So again, let me focus a bit on this one to kind of highlight the areas that we're interested in. So autonomous vehicles are obviously enabled by two major things. One, it's sensors. The other one is the data processing. So in terms of sensors, we're interested in everything that's outside the vehicle that gives you the perception. So LiDAR, radar, cameras, ultrasound, GPS, IMU, all the sensors that give you a sense of what goes on around the vehicle. In terms of processing, obviously artificial intelligence is a huge area of interest. Cybersecurity, as you have the vehicle connected, you have to be, obviously, have a secure connection. Mapping, edge versus cloud computing. So how do you separate the data? What data do you process at the vehicle? What data do you process geographically, locally, in temporarily relevant? And what data do you send back to the cloud to be processed and analyzed? Storage obviously becomes an important thing. So obviously huge amounts of data. How do you store it? Where do you store it? How do you make that a seamless transition? Data connection, again, huge amounts of data, but the connection is not always reliable. So how do you make this data transfer from the vehicle to the cloud and back on a seamless, continuously available, even if sometimes you don't have the best connection available. And obviously processors, so yes, we can use CPUs and GPUs, but we're also looking at dedicated silicon that can analyze very specific pieces of information, let's say from the camera, from LiDAR or radar. The other thing is, how we think about the vehicle. How do we participate? What is a vehicle, right? Like every time we think of cars, and especially us car guys, we can think of a car as something like this. It's a widget, it's a thing, it's kind of a piece of metal that's isolated. In the future, though, we need to start thinking of the car in this term. So this is a car, in the sense that a car is basically now becoming part of the ecosystem. All the cars will be connected with each other. They'll be connected with the infrastructure. Through the cloud and through the APIs and SDKs, you're going to have the ability for third parties to interact with this. So the way we need to think of the vehicle, it's much broader. We need to have a very holistic approach in how we transfer the data from the cloud to the vehicle. The cybersecurity that applies in the cloud is very different than cybersecurity that applies in the vehicle, and yet the two need to be connected. How do we monetize those services? How do we do software development? How do we basically make the car this seamless extension of our digital lives? So the trends I've seen, basically, again, being in the Valley, but also being a car nut for a long time, until about 4 years ago, as I said, we're still the weird kids in town. About 4 years ago, you kind of started seeing this movement that, okay, cars are becoming, the Silicon Valley started to kind of understand it better because things were starting to look familiar. It was more about software, more about sensors. About 2 years ago, things really started picking up. And you could see a bunch of people who really started to understand what we need. But really in the last year or so, there's been a tremendous explosion in the amount of companies that really, the startups that are starting to understand what we need, that have products and services dedicated to our needs, VCs that actually put money in auto tech. So there's been a really a huge explosion in what we can do in the Valley in terms of technology. The software impact has been tremendous. I mean, again, traditional OEMs have been mechanical engineering type companies. Now we're transforming ourselves into becoming software companies also because we need to take ownership of the software. But again, we don't know all the pieces. So there are chunks of software that we are going to have to get from startups, from this community that we need to bring in-house in order to integrate it with the rest of the vehicle. The other thing that's important to understand is that traditionally we've been buying pretty much everything in a vehicle from tier 1 suppliers. And then you have this pyramid where they would buy from tier 2s, and it was a very vertical integration type industry. We understand at least here from the Valley, we understand startups. We understand that you're not tier 1 suppliers. We understand your needs. We understand also that you don't necessarily understand us. So that's why we're here. We're here to become your advocates, your translators, to bridge the gap between the two cultures. And the really interesting thing is that a lot of these technologies don't have incumbents. So a lot of what's in a car today, they have incumbents in terms of tier 1 suppliers. And frankly, those are very hard to remove. It's very hard to get, to buy stuff from a startup when a tier 1 can supply it. But now there are a lot of technologies where the tier 1 suppliers can provide them because it never existed in the automotive industry. So there is a chance, there is a unique window where a startup can come in and provide something to an OEM. And if not, if let's say we can't trust a 2-person startup in a garage to provide us millions of units, we can make those introductions to the tier 1 suppliers. So in that case, it becomes a win-win where we get the product that we want, the tier 1 suppliers know that they have customers, and the startups get now integrated into the supply chain of an OEM. So that's basically how we work with startups. We have this initial engagement where we do tech scouting. We do a lot of filtering in-house. Again, that's why we looked at over 600 startups, but we don't want to shove them all into Dearborn. Part of the value add that we bring to Ford is this initial filtering. And then the value add that we do to the startups, to the community, is this feedback, that we provide feedback to the startups of what they do right and what do they do wrong. And I'm adamant about making sure that we get back to the startups really quickly. this is something that I know it's important for us, it's important for our reputation. So whenever our colleagues back in Dearborn don't give us feedback, I want to make sure that they get the right feedback, that that's not the right way to behave. So this is my promise that you will get feedback, positive or negative, but you'll get some feedback in a timely manner. Once we decide that it makes sense to work with someone, we typically do either a proof of concept in our lab here in Palo Alto, or, as I mentioned earlier, we have these pass-throughs where we find the right connection to the right people back in Michigan. And we stay engaged to make sure that that relationship is going smoothly, that we translate both culturally and technologically between the two worlds. Once we reach past this stage, we can go into technology development. Again, either we deploy it directly and we develop it to the point where it can be deployed, or we develop some sort of relationship with a tier 1 or tier 2 supplier, and then we as OEMs end up buying it from them. And finally, we can help with referrals to VCs, or ourselves can make financial investments in those startups that we really find absolutely critical, absolutely strategic to our business. In terms of, again, examples of company, the type of companies we've worked with in types of startups, we've worked with lighting, sensors, again, sensors both external and internal, air quality sensors. It's a thing that I didn't even know we needed until recently. Software, obviously, sensors, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence. Even manufacturing, as I said, when we connect them back to Dearborn for inspection on the assembly line, robotics, additive manufacturing, we've made this kind of connections back to the mothership. And then the other extreme, Ford Direct is it's another LLC that's owned by Ford and our network of dealers, and it helps them basically sell our vehicles, helps the independent dealers sell our vehicles. And we've helped them with parts management and advertising platforms. And then in terms of investments, you can see that those are public. So in terms of artificial intelligence, we acquired Sipes in Israel. We've made an investment in Argo.ai for autonomous vehicles. We've invested in Velodyne. And one thing that's important to mention is that none of these are exclusive. So whenever we make an investment, we still keep our eyes open for what else is out there. So just because we invested in Velodyne, it doesn't mean that we're not working with other LiDAR companies. We always keep our eyes and ears open for new technology. We understand, even if it's a sunk cost situation where something else is better coming next, we're not going to stay on, work only with the one that we invested in. We're open-minded enough to look around. If we make strategic sense at one point, that's fine, but we keep looking at other things moving in the future. Same thing, 3D maps, we invested in Civil Maps. Mobility, as I said, we acquired Chariot. And we also, this one in the electrical architecture, we haven't disclosed it yet, but the important thing is that we're not looking only for sexy investments. This one, it's actually as mundane as it gets, but saving money, saving weight is sexy. Improving quality is sexy. So we are looking for things that may be very mundane, but as long as it improves quality, saves money, provides revenue, we're obviously totally open to looking at those things. And that's all I have. I'm not sure do I take questions or not, or no? Okay.